Of course, I'm extremely grateful to be here again, and it's a great honor and privilege to be able to address this audience at these strategic conferences. And I also think that they fill a very important role to balance the, I would say, very much Anglo-Saxon view that we normally hear when it comes to strategy and security policy. So this, let's call it continental view on security and strategy, is a necessary complement to that, to my mind. And what I'll be speaking about is the interdependence of the Nordic states when it comes to security, and also what kind of strategic assessments or challenges they have to make. I will mainly speak about military strategy, but as you will see, military strategy very much depends on other factors, as the flow of goods and other things over the seas, through the air, and whatever. Then that will be the main topic that I'm speaking about. In the end, I will try to answer the conference question. That is, what we are discussing today when it comes to security and strategy, is it old or new wine, or in old or new skins? To begin with, when we look at the Nordic region, we see immediately that we are extremely dependent on the outside world. And when I speak about the Nordics, I mean mainly Sweden, Finland, and Norway. 80 to 90% of everything we import and export comes by sea. For practical purposes, we are an island, really. And without these connections with the outside world, we wouldn't survive for a long time. Societies would break down, industry would stop, and of course, military reinforcements wouldn't reach us. Before I leave this picture, I would like to point out one thing that is not always recognized when you speak about the Nordic area. Welcome. The Nordic area is extremely large with European measures. Just to mention some things. Oh, that wasn't. What happened? There. Wrong button. Just to take one example, from this point in northern Sweden to this point in southern Sweden, it's 1,600 kilometers. If you tip it over, then it stretches from Copenhagen in Denmark down to Rome in Italy. So it's, if you speak in Cold War terms, it's half of the European front between NATO and the then Warsaw Pact. And it's important to remember that when we start to speak about operational consequences of the strategic challenges we face at the moment. So, what would happen if there was a crisis or a war? The shipping in the southern Baltic or the Baltic Sea would more or less immediately stop. Because if you look at the A2AD systems that the Russians already have in Kaliningrad, then it means that we would have to try to look for reserve solutions to import and export things, or, as I said, get reinforcements from the outside world. And that applies to all countries in the region. Finland would be effectively cut off from shipping. And then the reserve alternatives, they are via the Swedish west coast, the Norwegian west coast, through Sweden, and that to Sweden also, and to Norway, northern Norway. And what more? It's the only way really to fly in reinforcements or to render air support to the Baltic states, 3 NATO members, that the alliance has to defend according to Article 5. But these reserve alternatives, they of course have a very limited capacity compared with normal shipping in the Baltic Sea. So the conclusions is, to begin with, the Nordic and the Baltic states are extremely dependent on each other when it comes to sea lanes of communication and, of course, also air lanes, what you call them, airspace. All countries are also dependent on each other when it comes to deter or meet a military aggression. No country can do it on its own. And from that you draw the next conclusion: the Nordic-Baltic region is one area of operations. And from that you could draw another conclusion. If something happens, especially in the Baltic Sea region, then all countries will be involved. Therefore, there is no real possibility to keep out of a conflict that would engage, let's say, the Baltic states, Sweden, Finland. Everyone will be involved. So, with this as a background, if we look at this from a Russian point of view, from the point of view of the general staff in Moscow, what would they think that, or what kind of opportunities would it give them? And here we see, I would say, 3 obvious options for the Russians that could be used, one of them, 2 of them, or all 3 of them at the same time. To begin with, it would be an obvious aim for the Russians to keep NATO out of the Baltic Sea. And here we see that the old Cold War problem with the Baltic Straits appears again. When it comes to cut off the Baltics and also be able to put pressure on Finland, it's also quite clear that if the Russians could build some kind of, let's call it, wall in Swedish airspace and on Swedish territory, the Baltic states would be, for all practical purposes, cut off, and so would Finland, really. And then we have the third one, perhaps the most interesting one, because it is so neglected when you talk about military strategy in the Nordic region. The Kola bases with submarines, long-range bombers, and also the nuclear submarines has been mentioned several times, but no one has really drawn any conclusions from that. What would that mean in case of a conflict in Europe or just in Northern Europe? If the Russian assets on the Kola Peninsula would be able to operate without any hindrance, that would mean that all sea lanes to Scandinavia would be cut off. The submarines would cut them off. But what more, and that is perhaps the most interesting and also fearsome aspect of this, if no one stops them, then also there would be a great risk to the sea lanes across the Atlantic. These submarines, they don't have to stay in the Norwegian Sea. They can also continue out into the Atlantic. And that now becomes a serious problem. It wasn't a serious problem 10 years ago, but now it has become a serious problem because Europe today is dependent on American support or American reinforcements. And the reforger concept from the Cold War has again become something that NATO planners are planning for. So the sea lanes and also the airspace over the North Atlantic has to be kept open. And that makes, I would say, extremely important, both for the Scandinavians, the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, but also for Europe as a whole, to do something about this, let's call it old, but at the same time now new threat to the sea lanes across the Atlantic and the North Sea. And who is supposed to stop these Russian assets, the long-range bombers, the submarines, even the Russian surface fleet? And as most of you know, Russia is reinforcing its maritime assets or navy assets quite drastically at the moment, building more submarines, more surface ships. They have a very impressive program, really, to reinforce their navy. And we already see the results of that. The first line of defense, that's the Norwegians. We heard about the Norwegian Navy yesterday, frigates, submarines, and some corvettes also. They are based in northern Norway. They have their bases there, and it's from these bases and in this area they are supposed to operate to be the first line of defense, if I call it that, against the Russian assets in Murmansk. Of course, they are supposed to be reinforced by NATO assets of different kinds, Americans, British, perhaps German. But nevertheless, northern Norway is, let's call it, a crucial piece of territory for NATO to stop the Russians, and of course equally important for the Russians to hinder NATO, Norway, to use this piece of territory. And obviously, very obviously, who is covering NATO's back in northern Scandinavia? Is Sweden and Finland. And today, if you look at Swedish defense planning and Swedish assets, it's clear that we have forgotten this very important task that we have in supporting NATO by defending our own territory. The Finns still have some capabilities, or they have some capabilities, but they are not that very big. So this is, I would say, a problem that we have in common, all the Nordic countries, but also NATO and the Nordic countries together. The south, the Baltic Sea, I've already mentioned the importance of the Baltic Sea when it comes to supporting the Baltic states, but also when it comes to supply Finland and Sweden to a very large extent. And here we have this scenario that I said, if the Russians manage to build a wall on Swedish territory, by deploying long-range surface-to-air missiles and also anti-ship missiles. It would create not just big problems for NATO supporting the Baltic states. I would say it would be an enormous problem, because then they would have to fight their way through Swedish airspace before they reached the Baltic states with some kind of support. That it would be an obvious problem for Finland also, it's quite clear. If this happened, Finland would be cut off from the rest of the world, both by sea and air. So, I start with the Nordic states, and this is really the conclusion from the title of the presentation. When it comes to interdependence, combined with strategic aims, then one common aim, and where we are dependent on each other, is protecting sea lines to Scandinavia. And that mainly is a problem connected with the far north. And that's a common problem for Finland, Sweden, and Norway, where we depend on each other. Protecting sea lanes to Finland, this oval number 2, the reserve alternative if the Baltic Sea isn't, if it isn't possible to use the Baltic Sea. That's a common interest for Sweden and Finland, because it's obviously in Swedish interest that Finland can continue and fight a war towards or against a common enemy. The big oval in the middle of Sweden, or in the southern part of Sweden, number 3, that is a prerequisite for receiving help from NATO, if such help materializes. And that's, of course, a common Nordic interest, Sweden and Finland. The Baltic states don't belong to the Nordics, but of course it's a vital interest for the Baltic states also. And keep the Danish straits open, a common interest for Sweden and Finland. And all these, let's call it Nordic common interests, without exception, are also in the interest of NATO. Then, of course, someone can ask the question, why don't we join NATO? But that is a totally different presentation. The short answer is it's out of domestic political reasons, where we can't, it's impossible to get a majority in Parliament for joining NATO. And once again, I would like to remind you of the geography and the distances that we are talking about. If we look at, let's call it this area of operations and this area of operations, if we put it a bit more south in Europe, that is really 2 campaigns, one conducted in northern Germany and one conducted in southern Italy. That's the distance between them. So it creates some operational and strategic problems, I would say. So, now we have seen all these problems. What are we doing about it? We are doing something about it. Norway and Denmark, they are increasing their, let's call it, not cooperation, they're intensifying their activities inside NATO, and for them, NATO planning, training and exercises has become a really important thing. To take one example, the Norwegians they have a pre-positioned marine brigade in the middle of Norway, in the region of Trondheim. Now they have asked more or less for a permanent American presence, a marine presence coupled to this brigade. They have had some 350 Marines there on a rotational basis. Now the Norwegians are asking for the Americans to double the size of this presence. So the Norwegians are really concerned. And the Danes have already started to redirect their defense efforts from international operations to, let's call it, international or multinational operations in the context of NATO in Europe. We, not being members of NATO, neither is Finland, have signed bilateral agreements with the US when it comes to military cooperation, also with the UK, and we are participating more and more actively in NATO training exercises, especially in the Baltic Sea area. Sweden and Finland, we have not signed, let's call it, agreement of mutual assistance, because I spoke about that last year, and there are, let's call it, some problems in making a formal pact between these countries. But we are planning together, and we are planning for contingencies beyond war, as the politicians say, beyond the peace, as the politicians say. And that's probably because it's hard for them to say war. But when it comes to practical things, we are planning for joint operations in war. And all Nordic countries are increasing defense spending, not enough, unfortunately. Neither of the countries will reach 2% in the foreseeable future, but nevertheless we are increasing defense spending. We are re-establishing a civil defense organization that was totally abolished after the Cold War, but now it's being re-established. We are heightening military readiness, and in the Swedish case we have reintroduced conscription, and the first soldiers started their training just 2 weeks ago. So, with this as a background, what would the answer be to the conference question? The conference question. What are we talking about? And the key words here of course, is attempts to serve old wine in new tubes, or old wine, or new wine in old skins. And my conclusion, with this as a background and what's happening in the Nordic area and the mindset that has changed drastically during the last 5 years, is this. In our case, classical military strategy is back with vengeance. We are talking military strategy again. And what more, when we are analyzing the problems, the challenges that we have to handle connected with these possible war scenarios, then it turns out that most of them, the problems, seem to be old wine in new skins. We are confronted by the same old problems that we have always been. And just to mention, Sun Tzu, okay, he's classical, he has a, let's call it, an overall view and strategy, and there nothing has changed. Clausewitz is also back. He looks at military things, at politics, and very much what he has written is applicable today also. And when we talk about hybrid warfare as part of these, let's call it strategic scenarios, not very much is new there either. Dzerzhinsky started the Department for Disinformation, or whatever you might call it, in 1923 in the then OGPU, the Cheka, if you want to call it that. So that disinformation is really, this kind of warfare is nothing new as a principle, really. And when it comes to influencing elections, public opinion, whatever, I would say that Dimitrov here, the boss of Comintern in the 30s, had quite elaborate theories about this, and he also practiced them. And our last friend here, Lawrence Friedman, I heard a lecture by him a short while ago, and he laughingly said, I thought that all my theories about nuclear weapons and how they can be used and not be used, that it belonged to the past. But now I'm in demand again. Everyone wants to hear what I think. So that's not something new either. One thing that is new is the cyber world. But here the question still remains unanswered. Is it just new tools that can be used based on old principles? Or is it really a revolution when it comes to strategy? And here I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone has an answer, because it's so new, so it has to be thought through, perhaps even practiced, before we can form any valid theories in this area. Thank you. And as I don't have this machine with me, please ask the questions in English. Or you might help to translate them if needed.
Thank you very much, General, for the lecture Nordic Strategic Interdependence. You pointed out the strategic view of the Nordic countries in order to prevent the Nordic area and the Baltic Sea from Russian influence and Russian military actions. You pointed out the Russian aims and the problem of the Nordic countries in order to act and to defend their countries and the area as a whole. It was quite clear in your presentation that no country in the Nordic Baltic region can solve this problem alone. And therefore you gave us a big impression about also the Nordic Baltic region as a whole, and you lined out the conference question. The military strategy is back, and of course there could be a possible hybrid warfare in that area. In order to follow on those things, what happened in Georgia, in Ukraine, what will be the next? Thank you very much for this presentation. I think you can I may please you to sit, to have a seat in the middle. Now we are open for, in case of the timeline, for 3 questions. Yes, please, first question.
Shall I answer your question? What will be next? Or
we can summarize.
okay.
Yeah, okay.
Helmut Malnik is my name. Sir, you have depicted a rather gloomy scenario. And I just wonder what would be the reason of the Russians to attack primarily, of course, because you are from there, the Baltic states. Do the Russians have free access, that means guaranteed corridor, to the Kaliningrad perimeter? And the pretext of attacking the Baltic states, I am just taking this away from you, yeah, would be to safeguard as a former or as a present Russian citizens in the Baltic states. Otherwise, I do not see any obvious reason. Thank you.
Yes.
That was the same question that you posed,
Yes,
really.
yes.
To begin with, I don't think that the Russians want more territory. They have enough of it. And unruly citizens, I think they have enough of them also. So what would be the reason to, let's say, attack the Baltic states to a larger or lesser extent? You don't have to take the whole of them. And that is not really connected to the Baltic states. It's connected with NATO and EU, I would say. If this disintegration of NATO continues, the transatlantic link becomes less and less stable. And the Russians might start to think that these security guarantees within NATO, the EU ones are quite useless from a military point of view. But if the security guarantees if they will not be upheld by the main NATO members, then they might see this, one, to increase their influence in the Baltic states by threatening them with military might, or even making some kind of South Ossetia solution in one of the Baltic states. But that's only one thing. The most important thing is probably that if the Russians did something in the Baltic states and NATO did not respond in force, then NATO would be dead as an alliance. And if the Russians at some point think that NATO will not respond, then they could prove that NATO is useless by doing something in the Baltic states. But if NATO, if the Russians made a wrong calculation, you never know. Saddam Hussein made a wrong calculation. Hitler made a wrong calculation. Several people have made wrong calculations in history. If NATO responded, then I would say my scenarios, if you call them that, become extremely realistic. So that would be. So Kaliningrad, okay. Of course, the Russians want a corridor to Kaliningrad, but I don't think they will fight for it. Then the methods, you mentioned the Russian-speaking minorities in the Baltic states. That could be a wonderful pretext, because that is a very nice option to try to keep a conflict under below the Article 5 level, where NATO has to respond with military might. It becomes a very unclear situation. So that is a weakness in the Baltic defense setup. Yes.
Next question. Yes, please, Professor.
Michael Codner from the Royal United Services Institute. We did a war game not very long ago, actually, with United Kingdom as framework nation in Latvia when the Russians move in to stabilize the eastern part of Latvia, and some very interesting problems all around to support that. You mentioned NATO commitment, etc., and the United States. We now have the United States regenerating the Second Fleet in the North Atlantic. We have NATO promoting the Maritime Command as well, and we've just written, last year we wrote a paper with the Norwegians on that subject. What do you feel should be the United Kingdom contribution, and how reliant could you be on them making a commitment, obviously with the Americans or not, depending on what happens?
The first and the easiest question is, of course, you should rebuild the Royal Navy. Today I think there is only 19 surface combatants. When the Cold War ended there was more than 50. So, but a bit larger Royal Navy, that would be a real nice thing. Not just for you, but also for us in Scandinavia. Then we have this cooperation with the UK. There we have this northern group. And I think it, in present day, today's circumstances, with Mr. Trump in the White House, it could be a good idea to deepen the cooperation between UK, the Nordic states, and it could be function as some kind of, if not mini NATO, but some kind of small insurance policy if other things don't work.
Fine. Last question, please. Just wait. Little moment.
General, very practical question. In reality, for example, at the Kosovo, we had Swedish officers in our staff, we had a Swedish contingent, it worked very well, we are very close, our doctrines are nearly the same, the decision-making process and so forth. And if, let me say, cooperation at the lowest level can set a process in motion which may result, for example, in the request of full membership in NATO of Sweden or so, why does this not happen? What is the reason for that? It's the same with the Finns. I had a wonderful Finn contingent or so, and they were easygoing, they worked extremely well.
Two answers. One, both of them, unfortunately, a bit pessimistic. The first one is that Swedish and German, I would say, staff procedures and leadership principles were extremely similar up till 1995, 2000, when we started to participate in international operations, because then we became, let's call it, Americanized. And from my point of view, being a former armor officer, that was very unlucky. We should have continued along the old lines. But there's a positive note to this also. Just the other week I received the new leadership book, or leadership methods, staff methods, from our Kampftruppenschule 2, our equivalent. It was awful, it was useless. I spoke to the chief of the army, and within 2 days the book was recalled. Now we are going to write a new one, going back how we did earlier. So in the future the cooperation will be perfect with the Bundeswehr. NATO. The parliamentary situation is at the moment, and will continue to be so for the foreseeable future. The former communists, the left, they are dead against. The Greens, they are dead against. The Social Democrats are against. Let's call it the Liberals and the Conservatives, they are pro-NATO. But now we also have this new populist party, the Sweden Democrats. They already have some parliamentarians, but it looks like they will have some, perhaps 20% of the votes in the elections in September. And then they are against NATO, they are against EU, they are against everything. They are dreaming back to a time when all Swedish children were blue-eyed, had blonde hair, were living in the countryside and were happy, a world that never existed. So, sorry, from a political point of view, there is no possibility that we will join NATO in the foreseeable future if nothing very radical happens in the vicinity. But sorry, I would hope that it wasn't so, but that's the way it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General, giving us the strategic view on the Nordic Baltic area. And as usual at this conference, I may say, on behalf of the organization of the conference, thank you very much, and I may hand over the strategic wine of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That will help me a lot.
Wie ich versprochen habe,
So like I promised, it was really a highlight of our conference. And I believe that such a presentation, and together with what Professor Matlovi showed yesterday, and also with what Frank Radke showed, is that we in Central Europe have a very distorted view of strategic reality. So on the one hand, there's this connection, this link between America, Great Britain, Norway, Sweden, and Finland on the one hand, and then the BRICS countries with the parallel Panama Canal. Well, I think that this is an arrogant and distorted perspective of a seemingly waning threat, and I believe that this presentation has shown it quite clearly via the northern flank. Now, the way forward, owing to this excellent presentation of our minister, where we provided more time for questions, we are now 15 minutes behind schedule. I believe we can catch up. So I would suggest that we start at 2 p.m. with the next item on the agenda, the panel on strategy and technical sciences here in the Sala Terrena. The panel on strategy in medicine, biology, and biotechnology will be meeting in the Kinosar in the cinema hall. Now, I would like to ask everybody to be back at 3:20 for the coffee break, and the two heads of the panels can provide us with their summary at 3:40 p.m. So it's important to make sure that both heads of the various panels be back at 3:40 on time. And I wish you all the best for your panels. Mr. Brigadier Fasching, please take over from here.